Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Arts Funders Forum virtual charrette, Building a Solidarity Economy for the Arts. We want to thank you all for being here with us today. I am Melissa Cowley Wolf. I'm the director of the Arts Funders Forum and the founder of MCW Projects. We are very honored today to have four incredible individuals with us for the hour to discuss how arts funders can encourage equality and solidarity in the arts sector, and in particular, discuss alternative artist-led economic models that encourage equity, cooperation, and self-determination in our communities. As a culture, and most definitely as a cultural sector, we are in a moment of profound reckoning, profound change. We are questioning our systems and structures, and we are asking if they still work for us, and actually if they ever did. Here at AFF, we are informed through our platform research, through ongoing dialogues, and through outreach. And we believe that the changes that many next generation funders, creatives, and cultural leaders had already wanted to see take place within our system are being accelerated by the events of 2020, which is hard to believe. We're halfway through the year and we've been through what we have. Many of the trends that were underway before the events, the pandemic-induced recession, and a growing social justice movement were underway, have now taken on extreme urgency. And we believe that we must collectively remake the model for arts philanthropy to respond. Our hope is that this collective dialogue and examination will enable the cultural sector to radically reinvent itself and come out more equitable and therefore stronger on the other side. So today's conversation feels like a natural continuation of our most previous Remake the Model event, which was held last month and featured Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, and David Callahan, the author and editor of Inside Philanthropy. Their talks provided us with a big picture context of why we are where we are with regards to wealth creation, philanthropy, power, and equality. And today, I'm honored to host this talk with four innovators who offer alternatives outside of our traditional funding structures for investing in arts and culture. These alternatives that are more equitable, more creative-centric, and sustainable, we hope. One of the Arts Funders Forum's main goals is to be a platform which encourages the development of new funding vehicles and new collaborations and partnerships in arts funding and in the cultural sector. And our hope is that we can position the models discussed today as new paradigms for a resilient creative sector. So at the helm of the conversation today is my guest host and co-organizer, Tempestt Hazel. I can think of no better collaborator for this discussion than Tempestt, who's a leader in the conversation on equality in the arts. Tempestt is a fellow Midwesterner and fellow Chicagoan, and is the arts program officer for the Field Foundation of Illinois, where she works with organizations, collectives, and artists to give grants and support to culturally anchored, justice-driven, and cross-sector community care work led by BIPOC organizations in chronically divested communities of Chicago. With an emphasis on racial equity, her work at the Field explores the ways in which Chicago's cultural workers and their communities can challenge the systems and develop alternative models that encourage self-determination and align with community-identified needs, culture, and values. Through her work as a curator and writer, she focuses on reframing cultural archives and institutional collections in order to draw connections between a variety of histories and the work of contemporary artists. As the founder of Chicago-based arts publication and archiving initiative, 60 Inches from Center, she promotes and preserves the practices of BIPOC and LGBT artists and artists with disabilities across the Midwest. In January of this year, the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, appointed Tempestt as a member of the Cultural Advisory Council of the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events to advocate for the arts community, including making Chicago livable and affordable for artists and creative professionals. Tempestt was the 2019 recipient of the J. Franklin Jameson Archival Advocacy Award from the Society of American Archivists. And she's also a sought after speaker. She's recently been featured and interviewed on Ergo Radio, WTTW Chicago Tonight, and she's participated in and led conversations with Apple and grant makers in the arts. I asked Tempestt to co-organize a program with Arts Funders Forum back in the spring. It's been a true pleasure to work with her, and she has shaped an exceptional discussion and brought together this incredible group of professionals. So Tempestt, I want to thank you. And a few notes for our audience and some housekeeping for today. I'm going to turn it over to Tempestt. She's going to engage the speakers in one-on-one interviews, and then we'll all come together for a group discussion, which will include audience questions. So please submit your questions today in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to pull out as many as possible in the group discussion. So now, Tempestt, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much, and take it away.
Yeah. Thank you. Wow. Really thorough bio there.
And that was pared down. That was a pared down version.
I appreciate that. So hello, everybody. I just want to say thank you to Melissa and to Arts Funders Forum for having this conversation and hosting this conversation. Like you said, my name is Tempestt Hazel. I'm the Arts Program Officer at the Field Foundation. And to tell you a little bit about Field, Field Foundation is a Chicago-based foundation that focuses on grant making through a racial equity lens. Much of our work is informed by and focuses on community-rooted and community-led models developed by individuals, collectives, cooperatives, coalitions, and organizations that are working in justice, arts, media and storytelling, and leadership investment. And because we understand how race operates and impacts our city and the country, we believe that it's really important to hold that at the forefront of how we direct our support. We also know that as a foundation, we are not the experts. The people living, working, and building within these communities on a day-to-day basis are the experts. So we learn from them, we turn to their work to inform and shape how we do our work, because at the end of the day, our work is about helping them do what they do with as few strings attached as possible, knowing that they already hold many of the solutions to the challenges that they face. They just need more resources to address them and more megaphones to amplify those models. So when we at Field talk about remaking the model, we're talking about it in multiple ways. And we're coming from the starting point of knowing that we're living within systems, including philanthropy, that have not worked for many Chicago residents, particularly Black, Indigenous, and POC residents, and our communities. And this applies nationally as well. But simultaneously, we're also coming from a starting point of knowing and having strong examples historically and today of organizations and individuals who are building or have been operating alternative models, alternative ways to care for our communities and to address individual and community needs, ways that are generative, restorative, transformative, and not destructive or violent or causing generational damage. For us at Field, remaking is about building and breaking at the same time. So building up the work of people like Hoda, Angie, and Eric, and many others like them, whether in Chicago or the Bay Area or beyond, and then breaking and interrogating the systems, structures, and processes that have proven themselves time and time again to be active adversaries of equity and justice and liberatory creative practice. So much of that breaking and building is external work, but also I believe it's deeply internal. As Field changed its grant-making model toward racial equity, the foundation also knew that it wasn't enough to just write it in the mission. It also had to turn its gaze inward and interrogate its own processes and the way that it might be preventing itself from reaching these individuals, these artists, these collectives, these organizations, and these communities. We had to embrace risk, experimentation, and question the rubric through which we define and measure things like success or viability or financial health. When grant making for arts and culture, I constantly question terms like quality and value, knowing that historically the ways that these terms have been defined within our country didn't have Black or Indigenous or POC artists or the community rooted or ancestral practices of those people in mind. So I haven't talked much in this intro and this framing about art, because that's another important thing to understand. Art and culture is so infused in the ways that these communities understand themselves as we understand ourselves and the communities that we're a part of, that it doesn't always need to be stated explicitly. It's very much so implicit. It's infused within any conversation about community, justice, self-determination, autonomy, power shifting, and radically imagining and co-creating a future that works for all of us, not just some of us. And I'm incredibly, incredibly honored to be able to share this space and this conversation with all of you and 3 people who deeply inspire me in doing this work and truly are leaders in remaking and breaking the models and making visible a more equitable future. So to kick off the conversation, I'm going to be talking with Hoda, and I'll be asking each of the speakers the same 3 questions in order to get their take on some of these ideas and the work that they do. Hi, Hoda.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
Doing well as we can be. Thanks so much for having me into the Art Funders Forum. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So to dive right in, can you talk, I mean, this is actually a big question, but can you talk a little bit about who you are, what you do with Blueton and perhaps otherwise, because you do so much, and what brought you to this work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So my name is Hoda Katebi. I'm an Iranian American community organizer. And for me, that's first and foremost how all of my work is really grounded from a community organizing lens. I run a bunch of different projects that are sort of looking at different sort of systemic issues, I think either through an arts-based lens or otherwise. So doing a lot of campaigns around surveillance or incarceration. I also write and publish writing, but I also am a member of Believers Bailout, which is a Muslim-led bail fund that bails Muslims out of pretrial incarceration and immigration detention. An organizer with the No War campaign, so trying to end sanctions on Iran, as well as thinking about the role of the military-industrial complex in police militarization, and founder of Because We've Read, which is a radical international book club with chapters around the world that really tries to push literacy and also gets books that are banned into different places around the world. And of course, also founding member of Blueton Production, which is an all-women immigrant and refugee apparel manufacturing workers cooperative.
So much. So, you know, one of the things that I really, when we first had conversations about Blueton, what I really loved about it was the fact that you were pushing against so many things, so many different models that already exist, whether within the fashion industry or just thinking about a worker-owned cooperative, knowing that within the state of Illinois, that's a relatively recent legal entity. So it's exciting to think that you all are kind of at the forefront of shaping that. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the models that you're remaking and that you're pushing against and that you're calling into question, and the ways that you're doing that.
Mm-hmm. All of it. We're calling everything into question. And I think for me, like, I think why fashion is like such a powerful, I guess, medium of work is because if we look at the fashion industry, particularly at the very bottom of the supply chain and garment workers, we see so many of these violent systems: capitalism, incarceration, policing, militarism, patriarchy, sex. All of these are like so deeply entangled. And so for me, it's such a powerful place to be able to really explore how all of these like isms are related to each other and bringing like sort of collaborating in their violence. But I think so at its core, Blueton is sort of an abolitionist response to the fast fashion industry. Just like right now we understand abolition and we're learning, which is great. Abolition is a little bit more of a mainstream term now, that it means that institutions that are inherently violent and require violence can't be reformed, right? Like we can't make slavery better. We have to get rid of the institution. And so thinking about abolition in terms of police or prisons, but in terms of fast fashion is the same. There's no way that fast fashion can be produced ethically or sustainably, but all of us still need clothes. And so what does it mean to be able to create clothes in a way that is exciting and is healthy and actually is led by the people who are actually physically making our clothes? So I think at the core of Blueton is trying to radically reimagine the way that our clothes are made, and with it, what the entire supply chain and how that needs to be like reconfigured. Instead of sort of like working from like the top of the supply chain or top of the food chain and trying to like reform our way down, we're really sitting at like the core of where all of this violence sort of intersects, and trying to explore what it means to actually flip power, and working with people who are historically the most marginalized and enfranchised by the fast fashion industry, which is women, particularly women of color, particularly migrant women of color, and thinking about what it means when they're in charge and they own the means of their own production. They get to actually have a say in what designers we take on, how things are made, wages, hours, everything. And we've been able to just see like a radically exciting result because of that as well.
Yeah. And I think too about just the way that Blueton operates and the model that you're using for your operations to be able to take advantage of the fact, like, I remember in a conversation that we've had, you said that you're not against profit, you are for profit. But also, Field Foundation has been able to direct support to Blueton's work because you are a fiscally sponsored project. So can you talk a little bit about that mixed model?
Yeah, definitely. So for us, like, we're a workers cooperative, but based on the recommendation of our lawyers, we are registered not as a nonprofit and not as a workers cooperative, but as an LLC. And that's important because we want to get our people paid, like, we're not trying to just like get somebody, who has 5 kids and is single, a job at like, a minimum wage job that just like we can say that we got them a job, right? Like, every person has a right to not just survive, but to thrive. And if we can actually decide what that looks like, then we're actually like, we're in it to get people paid and actually talk about what financial mobility looks like, not just financial survival. And I think that it's been just so beautiful to be able to like be a part of that, but also on a deeper level, like, a lot of our members are sort of immigrants and refugees, and for the safety of all of our members, we do not want to be filing as a 501c3 just because of how much sort of like involvement there is at different levels, and not because like we're trying to like hide any sort of information, but more because we just want to have the flexibility and the sort of the freedom to be able to operate in a way that makes sense for our members first and foremost, and prioritizing that. So it's been a challenge actually to be able to receive funding from foundations who are so set in like, we only fund nonprofits, because we like, for the safety of our members and for like the point of our organization is to prove that you can be profitable by centering humans and not capitalism, I think has been a big challenge for us.
Yeah. So that brings me into the next question of those challenges. Let me start on a high note. What are some of the successes that you've experienced with the work with Blueton? And you've only been around for about 2 years now, right? Going on 2 years?
Yes, going on 2 years. Yes. So many things that I wasn't even expecting, which is like, I think the most exciting thing is just the magic that happens when women of color, working class women of color, are literally deciding everything. So we didn't even go into 2000, like last year, we didn't even like sit down and have a conversation about how to reduce waste. But when we look back on the waste that we produced, it was negligible. And that's a sort of a global standard for manufacturing. There is no mass production of apparel globally that has negligible waste produced and zero plastic purchase. And this was an accident. It's just because working class women of color do not throw anything away, for better or for worse. And I mean, it's just like, it's so naturally like sustainable. And I think that's what's been so exciting, is that we've been able to set all these global bars and global standards, not intentionally, but just by virtue of who's in charge and who's making these decisions. We also set a pretty large industry like standard in terms of manufacturing, in terms of labor standards. So in most fast fashion factories globally, less than 1% of money coming in from contracts are allocated toward labor. But last year, an average of 70 to 80% of every single contract went directly toward labor. And so combination of both our membership structure, our business structure, and then also who those members are, has been just so exciting on like an external scale, but then also on an internal like level, just the small conversations that come out of just a space that feels so safe and feels so like human centered, like being able to have, you know, someone who is facing domestic violence actually be able to get the help they need just by like having little conversations and then realizing that they're in a situation of domestic violence, and then being able to deal with that. And us, you know, like connecting to people. So it's just little things, or like destigmatizing mental health, just in a casual conversation. And it's something that, like, you know, so many people go out and be like, we are an organization just to destigmatize mental health. But I think it's so exciting to see that all happening, and like these little magical moments that are just every day that just are in the studio.
Yeah. And then we only have maybe about 20 seconds. So I do want to ask you, what is one of the biggest challenges that you faced? You've already kind of spoken to some of them, but if there are any others?
I think just how many things that we're trying to challenge. I specifically trying to operate a human-centered like company in a capitalistic world has been really challenging, because we're not just trying to, like, you know, like center the people who we're trying to center, but we're also trying to reimagine and invent a new wheel for the first time. Like there's not a guidebook or a rule book, and there's just so many layers of like capitalism, fashion. Like I'm Iranian, and like if are there any Iranians in the audience, like we're very dramatic people, but you have not met a fashion designer. So just like dealing in the industry is complicated. So I think there's a lot of like layers.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then we will turn to Angie. Do we have Angie?
Hi.
Hi, Angie. I see you now.
Yay.
How are you doing?
I'm relatively well. We are in a staff, families are safe and have been well, and we've been privileged to do a lot of relief work, relief regranting. So we're in a really privileged position. So thank you for asking.
It's always good to see you.
See you.
Diving right in, can you talk a little bit about who you are, what you do with the Center for Cultural Innovation and Ambitious, and what brought you to that work?
Yeah. So I've been a long time arts and culture funder, with most of my experience being in supporting individual artists through competition, open application, individual artists funding programs. And I had long known of this organization. I knew its founder, and I had been on its board. And when I took the helm, I don't know, but maybe like 5 years ago, I knew when I came into this organization, Center for Cultural Innovation, that its focus, which is on supporting individuals in the arts, was something that aligned strongly with my own values, that I also appreciated that most of the nonprofit system is about institution to institution support with very little trickling down to people and their communities. And so when I came on board, the first thing I interrogated was this idea that we have a catchphrase that we're doing this work to support individual artists to achieve financial sustainability. And I was like, right away, I was like, that's bullshit. Like, we don't do financial sustainability. We have a lottery system. If you get it, like, lucky you for that year, but heaven help you 5 years from now or when you retire. And as an entire infrastructure of artist funders, none of us were actually creating systems for financial sustainability long-term, not only for the artists we were focused on, which are Western European hegemonic normatives, but for a larger swaths of America. So what that led to was starting Ambitious, which is our national pooled fund initiative in 2019, where we try to go as upstream as possible and trying to understand what are the things that we can influence in order to achieve not just financial sustainability, but for sure better support systems, better ways of moving capital to artists, but also looking at a different goal, which is really around financial self-determination. We don't really want to keep people in a position where they are beholden to donors outside their community, philanthropic interests. That's not determination, self-determination. That's a charitable model where where we are reifying power and imbalances. So anyhow, that's the motivation for Ambitious. Is that enough there?
No, I mean, you've already kind of started to touch on my next question about this series is called Remake the Model, and I find it interesting because you're really in this place where, similar to Field, trying to remake a philanthropic model, but then also, with Ambitious, you're deep diving into learning from different models that folks are using. Especially, I've been particularly inspired by what's happening in Oakland and a lot of the organizations that you work with. But I'm wondering if you could talk more about the models that you're remaking, the ones you're pushing against, which you've already kind of talked about, and why it's important for those models to be remade.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So for my own purposes, I look at 3 buckets of how funders are motivated to make the decisions. Are they in the bucket of reifying the status quo? Like, the status quo is great and we need it to keep going. Interpret it however you want. The status quo is amazing, but it has so many problems, high incarceration rates, whatever, environmental pollution, but we can try to fix the current system as best as possible. And in my own sort of parlance, it's a institution-based, it's a very for-profit, profit at all costs, frankly, to people on the planet. It's neoliberal. I mean, our entire philanthropic sector is heavily leaning toward neoliberal privatization rather than depending and growing public support. That's the system that a lot of funders, I think, are right now in which they're trying to fix that. What we appreciated is when we started to look around and go, okay, well, maybe we'll try to help accelerate fixing current situations. And what we found is when we actually went into cultural communities where artistic vitality and expression and strong social ties are happening, for the most part, they're not interested in the current system. In many ways, the current system has failed them, right? And so what we realize is, for those who are trying to create financial self-determination and agency and shifting power, for those communities, a lot of them were saying, we don't want to do it through the nonprofit structure. We don't want to do it through, long-term dependence on the whims of foundations. And so where we are is this kind of third bucket, which is we are trying to help advance alternative systems, alternative economic systems, how money moves. What we see there is that money moves in a different paradigm. It's culturally inflected, it's localized. Nothing is about getting everything to scale. It's not super privatized or non-profitized. It's very much about community control. That's where cooperatives, that's where businesses, like what Hoda is talking about, where the workers are part of the governance infrastructure. Those types of efforts are the ones that we see a lot of promise in. And I'll just say one more thing, which is, when you talk about remaking the model, so in that language therein, that's also weird to me, because a lot of the stuff we are trying to shine a spotlight on is not about remaking the model, right? There are many models, people who talk about indigenizing the economy, for instance. And what we're trying to really do is really both fund those efforts that are about alternative systems, but also shift our funding behavior to actually behave in ways that support that, which means not giving grants based on projects, but rather based on, first and foremost, who are we doing this for? Exactly which community. It's not enough to say we're doing it for Oakland. That's not specific enough. For Oakland, we're prioritizing multi-generation Black Oaklanders. That totally changes the equation of how we should behave then with our capital.
Yeah. That's great. So then, what are your biggest challenges in this work? Well, I'll do like I did with Hoda. What are your biggest successes so far in the around 2 years that you've been doing this?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like also with like what Hoda was saying, this is an exciting time. When we were doing the R&D for a year before we launched Ambitious, when we looked around the country at what is happening, there's a lot of new stuff happening. And what I mean by that is what we found was there's a lot of vitality at the intersection of alternative economy work, which is really around like trying to create freedom from capitalist inflected systems, with an intersection with a racial equity or economic justice lens. which is what is different in this moment than, for instance, what had happened in like the 1960s as an example. Because now alternative economy work in our purview is not just about like an alternative to the system, it's about alternatives to the system in ways that shift power. And so I'm not claiming like that's a success we had. I just say that as like, this is a really exciting moment. This is not a moment that calls for, let's keep funding innovations. Like, fund ideas all you want, but the best bet for capital is fund the stuff that's been happening, I would say, within only the last 5 years. People are already out there building entire infrastructure for alternative systems. It's just that our 501c3 specific lens prohibits us from actually seeing that work.
Yeah. And then in about 15 seconds, can you say one of the biggest challenges that you face?
I think the biggest challenge for us is because we are doing this work as a way to shift funder behavior. It's about convincing funders that they can actually go outside the 501c3.
Yeah, just that. That's a good one. That's a really good one. All right, so thank you. We will talk more in a minute, and now we will turn to Eric.
All right, hey.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, good.
Good to see you.
You too.
We'll dive right in. I think you know the question. It's coming. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do with Silver Room and Proximity, and what brought you to this work.
Sure. The Silver Room, it's a retail space that operates at the intersection of arts and culture and entrepreneurship. I kind of got there from my background, growing up in the 80s, being a lover of house music in Chicago. You know, that was like my driving force, you know, and I was a finance major. So when I finally opened up this space after 10 years of being actually a street vendor, I wanted to have a space that I could use to not just make money, but also help other people, host other people's artwork, have folks come in and DJ, just this art space / retail space. So, but it was really informed by my personal background, which is my love of being an entrepreneur, which being a street vendor, in my opinion, is like the rawest form of being an entrepreneur, and also, you know, arts and culture.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about this? Well, so you have the Silver Room, which is the retail space, but then you also have Silver Room Foundation and Proximity. Can you talk about why it was important to go from the Silver Room, which started to expand and do so many different things, to needing these other entities in order to do and expand your work?
Sure. So, you know, the Silver Room inherently is a retail space, but very quickly I realized people wanted to use it for other things, you know, be it for art shows, be it for, you know, book releases, you know, whatever that was. So in the last few years, I realized that this space was limited in a way because it's one singular space. And I'm really thinking about how I can lend my 20 plus years of expertise, if you call it that, or experience, to help other people. So what the foundation really is about is thinking about spaces outside of where I'm at in other neighborhoods, be it South Shore or the West Side, how we can create a commercial district in all of these blighted communities that have, you know, empty storefronts, sometimes it's 70%, empty spaces. How I can help other entrepreneurs, you know, find these spaces, help support them to help build a community, hopefully, in these spaces. So that's what the foundation really is. It's not about me having more space. It's about me helping other people create their own space. And the larger picture is how can we help a whole community build from people who live in the community?
Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, when you think about retail, like a store, there's a very specific way that you kind of think about that. And for you, I feel like your work has expanded in a way that it is busting open different kinds of models. So if you could you talk a little bit about the models that you're pushing up against and that you're remaking and that you're calling into question by doing the work that Silver Room as a store does, but then also these other projects? Sure.
I'm always very clear that we are a for-profit business. I have no problem saying that, you know. And for me, I just was thinking about this idea of a nonprofit and how nonprofits operate. It was very difficult for me to even think about that, you know, in a sense of writing grants, trying to wait for somebody to give you money, when my street hustle tells me, man, I could just make the money myself, right? And I could create space for people in my store. So that was always the mentality was a little bit different. It was driven by for profit. If we make a little bit of money today, I can host an art exhibit for somebody, and they don't have to pay, or they can pay a little bit of money. If we can make some money today, we can put on this block party, which started off as a small block party, but it became a very big block party. So it was always this meaning of this for-profit model, but having a social impact. Now they call it a social enterprise. This is like the new term. That term didn't even exist, 22 years ago when I started. It was like, I just made some money. Can we do some good things? So I think the issue right now, and maybe this is your last question, is how foundations and funders look at for-profit businesses. Because for me, the way to really look at a sustainable model, if you really want to think about these communities that are blighted, is funding for-profit businesses. I would argue that the Silver Room has done more cultural events than a whole bunch of nonprofits, and we've done it with no money from funders. So what if we had somebody give us, $20,000, and we can use that for other things? So I think that's kind of where I'm thinking about this model of this for-profit supporting quote unquote nonprofit activities.
Yeah. So you've spoken to a little bit of the challenges. Can you talk about the successes?
I would say the success is 22 years in business for a retail store. That's not easy, and especially 22 years doing the things that we do that are not, they're not always motivated by making money. So that's, to me, is a huge success. The success of, generating, $5 million over the last, several years from the block party, from our vendors that sell jewelry, from our artists that sell their artwork, creating a platform for a whole side of Chicago that they can be a part of, and people know that they can be a part of it. So that, to me, is my biggest success, is that we work with visual artists and DJs and models and all kind of creatives that, and somehow they can also be a part of the space and make money.
Yeah, and you've already spoken a little bit to this, but are there any other challenges that you can think of or that you'd like to talk about?
Well, kind of what both Angie and Hoda mentioned is this idea of a for-profit business being like evil in some ways. And I mean, I'm being a little extreme on that, but the idea that only nonprofit businesses or entities should be funded, and I'm really into this idea of how can we fund for-profit businesses. And I know the whole tax break thing is not part of that, and the structure of the 501, the 501. But for me, a challenge has been, okay, this guy's making money doing this. Why should we support him? So now I have to rename myself with a different label, say, oh, I'm a nonprofit, and then you'll give me money. But we're still doing the same work. I would argue we're doing even more work. So I think it's just it's the expression of who we are as a retail space to the public, to understand that these not just Silver Room, but all retail spaces and all for-profit businesses need support also.
Yeah.
So I think that's like a new challenge.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And so I think now we'll turn it to the group discussion and get all of you together. And I'll kick it off with a question. All right, so I'm going to kick it off with a question, and then I believe Melissa will come back and kind of field other questions coming in from the lovely folks out there who are watching. So first, we're in a challenging time right now, but I also think that this is a time of imagination and dreaming. So the question that I have is, if you could snap your fingers and change one thing about how investments are made within the arts sector or within community cultural work, what would that change be?
Aside from more money and less strings.
Aside from that, no, that's a good one.
I would say if there was a way to create a policy that there was the same kind of tax benefits to give money to for-profit businesses as there are for nonprofit business. I keep going back to the same thing, but I think that would be a huge thing if we could figure out ways to support the local coffee shop, for example. And you had the same benefit as you would if you were supporting an arts organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, and on a real note, while I do agree with my first statement, I think I would say like two things. Like one, I feel like there's still just so many hoops to like jump through and so many like things you have to like chase down. And I feel like it takes so much time and energy away from the actual work to have to like follow up with a funder or like a program officer to connect me to somebody. Like it just feels like it's all networking. And like, I feel like that's just so draining and so frustrating and doesn't like, that's not how I build community or how I've learned to build community. And so I think the ways in which like the whole sort of industry works, I think is like really sort of exclusionary in a way and is really difficult to like navigate, especially because I feel so new to this whole world. And then on a second note, I also think that I really, and Tempestt also mentioned some of that in her intro, but like I kind of want to challenge this idea of risk. I feel like on paper, like things may not always like feel like financially stable or financially like lucrative, but I think risk is like such a debilitating like factor of like organizations getting money. And I feel like the organizations that are truly the most visionary feel like too much. You know, I remember even when Tempestt and I first talked, she's just like, you're trying to do a lot. And I was like, yeah, I know, but like, it's possible, right? And we're able to do it. And we have been working on all of this. And so, and the fact that like Tempestt and Field Foundation was the first funding that we ever received, like that allowed us to like open doors for other foundations. But if Tempestt did not actually be like, okay, like this sounds crazy, but like I will believe you, I think that like we could still have like not even been able to open our doors. So I think risk is like such a frustrating term that is really also exclusionary and pushes a lot of like innovative, visionary organizers, young people out of the way, and they're crazy but like important ideas.
Yeah. So I don't know if Angie has anything to add or if Melissa has a question to throw in the mix.
I think Eric and Hoda got it.
You know, it's really interesting. You know, something that I'm hearing through all of your feedback has to do with this issue of narratives and the narrative of contemporary philanthropy and how we have support from VCs, we have private equity involved, we have the traditional 501c3 method or vehicle, but there isn't necessarily the connection being made. And the narrative about what philanthropy is and who it funds, from what I'm hearing, there's this desire to expand it and this need to expand it and to update the narrative for the community based on that need. I think the three of you have done a really great job of expressing that need. It's something I want to go back to in a later conversation, but just something I noticed from Tempest's question. And you know, at the forum, we're really interested in this issue of narratives and storytelling, and how do we position these new models to a larger audience? And I think you all represent, you know, a way to kind of blow people's minds about what is possible. So I want to thank you for that. I want to get to a question from the audience first. This was submitted on the registration form. And so I want to pose it to you, and I also want to open it up to the audience to respond in the Q&A chat, because it's also geared towards funders. And it comes from Jordan at Chicago's Comfort Station. And he's interested in the possibility of grassroots spaces and ensembles coming together under a shared 501c3 as a way to kind of leverage funding opportunities and access nonprofit funding streams. For example, apartment studios and dance ensembles coming together with experimental music groups as sort of a portfolio. So he wants to ask, you know, the funders on the call, would this be a viable model from a funder's point of view? And also get some feedback from those of you on the call about this idea of stronger and more collaborations and partnerships, not from the funder side, but from the fundee side. And how have you worked in those ways in your work previously?
Tempestt, do you have a response or?
Yeah, I mean, what I can say about that is, one of the things that I hear the most are the challenges of capacity. And something like that, depending on how it's structured, definitely allows for sharing of capacity, sharing of resources, sharing of knowledge of the workload, and opportunity, just widening the opportunity for funding in ways that could definitely be interesting. And I think, when it comes to a lot of the organizations that we have relationships with that fields think about that a lot, or are doing that. Things like co-location. I know Blueton's thinking about that right now. Sharing space, sharing resources, and being able to build capacity together. And that seems like it's along those lines. So I think from the funder side, as I always hear about capacity being a challenge, time being a challenge, folks with certain pools of knowledge and expertise being a challenge. That seems like something that could address that. So I think that it's always worth exploring, and I'm sure there are examples out there of things like that. I think of there's an organization called Arts Pool, I believe, in New York that does some work like that. But yeah, it is an interesting model to use.
I mean, I think the question for me, we work with artists so often, and I have sort of a little bit of a canned response. It's what's your purpose in terms of who you're supporting? If it is, I would say, and this is not meant to be pejorative, please don't take it this way, but if it's meant to be fine arts type of work that does get rewarded in nonprofit circles, then yeah, maybe finding a fiscal sponsor or working through that, knowing that you really are better served getting contributed income versus earned income the way Eric and Hoda do. If you want the mix, you certainly not getting your own 501c3 gives you a little bit more flexibility. But overall, what I would say is, and it actually goes to something, Melissa, you were saying about the narrative shift. I mean, this is inherently a bit of the problem, right? We're asking artists to choose business models that are inherently basically broken. Entire systems, the financial industry system, public sector money, which is mostly based on contracting out for specific products and services, which the nonprofit philanthropy sector copied. Most of our funding is project restricted because we are contracting out and therefore absorbing people's attention and time spans in service to foundations' priorities. So I'm not saying that to be super facile about it. I'm just really pointing out facts. And so if you at all are interested in if I don't want to be co-opted for my cultural community, which has historically and to this moment remains marginalized from the dominant conventional systems, then this is why we're saying there is alternative efforts happening that is not requiring you to have your time sort of going into Eric, you were saying, just the idea of operating a nonprofit, it's exhausting, right? You do so
much paperwork.
Hey, right. So that's why we focus our rudder on financial freedom, and also, I didn't say it earlier, ownership. If we don't have ownership, wherein the community owns it, the workers own it, artists own it, then we are perpetuating a system that is actually more in service to institutionalization and not for communities.
Yep.
Thank you all. We're being cognizant of time. We have questions coming in, and we could talk all day with you guys, but I'm going to kind of bounce around here a little bit. We have an audience question from Nick Wiley, specifically for Hoda, asking if you could speak more about how the members that are involved in cooperative decision-making, how does that process work? What's easy and difficult about it, getting into the nitty-gritty, and how do people become workers and owners?
Yeah, for the sake of time, I answered that in 3 long paragraphs in the answered section. So I hope that's okay if there's anything that I should elaborate on. I wrote an essay.
Can I add to Hoda's? I thought your comments were really great under the answers. Thanks, Hoda. I'll just add from a funder perspective. Cooperatives are corporations just like a nonprofit is a corporation, an LLC is a corporate entity. They're no different. They are profit making. What we look for as a funder of cooperatives is two things, and they don't have to be both, but do they own title to their assets as a cooperative? And what is the governance, the decision making that happens that is cooperative? And those two do not always have to be there. But from our perspective, in terms of shifting power, we are looking for both. And as an example, right now in this economic recession that may turn into a longer term depression, we're also trying to get funders to really think about this moment as an opportunity for the people we care about to exert ownership. There will be land grab opportunities by private developers coming out of this. There will be just greater displacement of people that we care about. We can actually be just as competitive. This is the time to help artists who are behind on their mortgages renegotiate, or art spaces that are paying down their mortgages to maybe close the gap so that they can actually stay a long-term anchor in their communities.
Thank you. This next question is for Tempestt. You spoke at the beginning about the transition that the field went through with the goal of putting racial equity in the center of its grant making, which is a process that started in 2016 with the arrival of the current president, Angelique Power. You spoke very eloquently in your introduction about how funders fund the experts, and those experts in the community need more resources. I love what you said, that how remaking is about building and breaking. And you said that this process it's not enough to look externally, but you have to look internally, and that it's an internal process of examination that's needed. Since we're now seeing funders make this transition and these announcements come out in the wake of a growing social justice movement, and some of these funders are on this call, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that transition, specifically the internal examination that's necessary, and just, one essential step that funders can take to go through that internal examination process in order to make this shift in funding effective, but more importantly, authentic.
Yeah. Oh, ooh-wee. A whole other hour-long discussion.
Completely.
I think the first step, and a lot of it, so I came after this process. It was almost as if, I came into fields as the process was being implemented, as the new grant making model was being put into action and being shaped. So the process before then, as I understand it, had a lot to do with really getting everyone on board and starting with the board, and really doing some work to do things like anti-racist training, getting everyone on the same page, and getting everyone to a place where you have a basic understanding of systemic racism and how it's operated historically and how it does now. And a lot of the case making that Angelique and Mark Murray, our president and VP, were able to do was really, the change happened because they were able to kind of set that foundation. They made it hard to question the shift in the grant making and shift in the focus because of, you can't argue with history. You can't argue once you start to really, truly illuminate and see the systems and how these systems are working against these communities. And also, philanthropy in a lot of ways, for better or for worse, is data driven. So they had the evidence, they had the information, to be able to back up what they were saying and make that case. So the shift really happened in that way of being able to have an honest conversation and an understanding of history and how systemic racism has infiltrated all areas of our daily lives and really caused a lot of problems. And that really revealed the way for that field could be more impactful in its grant making. And it's definitely not perfect. We are constantly learning, which is why I really value hearing from Angie, Eric, Hoda. Like, this helps to shape what it is that we do, because we're still testing and learning and shifting and changing along with along with everyone else in this process. So, you know, you put things to paper, and then there's the whole process of actually like implementing it, which has been a completely wild ride, but it's been really interesting to realize that it's not just about what you write in your mission. It's not even just about like the grants that you give, that you're able to say outwardly, you know, we support these folks that are doing this great work. We also have to look at how we're treating ourselves, the policies and the ways that we act internally and operate internally as an organization are mirroring and really speaking to the same kind of values and principles that we say externally, and in many ways that the organizations and the people and the communities that we seek to support are putting into practice on a daily basis. So that's my quick answer to that.
Thank you. And we're going to do a whole hour on that alone. So hold you to it. One last question before I turn it back to everyone for kind of last thoughts. We got a couple questions about this, and one particularly from Fred Bidwell on the call. And I'm going to open it to the group, but specifically start with you, Eric. You know, what do you see as the role for equity investments to support for-profit social enterprise? You talked about what struck me is again, the narrative that needs to change in order for our ideas of what funding could be to open up. And so going off of Fred's question, you know, how can funders take the first step in changing their mindset to fund for-profit business, and to Fred's question, the role for equity investments to support for-profit social enterprise?
Right, true, got it. So my first thought is that, you know, a big part of racial equity is economic equity, right? So you can't have one without the other. I was thinking about this, you know, this fundraiser I went to, my first fundraiser back in the day, and it didn't feel good, you know, as a Black man from Chicago, seeing this hierarchy of who had the money, who was given the money, and who was, you know, being the benefactors of the checks. It didn't really feel good, you know. And I saw a couple write a check for $100,000, like it was nothing. And so my first thought is like, man, how'd you make you know, how can you give away $100,000? What are you doing? You know what I mean? So I was more interested in that. So for me, it's about, you know, this structure of the haves and who's given money, the foundations, and to me, lending knowledge and information to those folks that say, hey, we can actually build our own communities in some ways. Let's learn from you how you made your money. As part of this donation, also lend some time and some energy and some effort into helping us be sustainable in our own way. So I think it's the money for sure, but also it's the knowledge and resources and information.
Thank you. Tempestt group, any last closing thoughts you want to say to the community of funders, cultural leaders, artists, fundraising professionals who are on this call? We have just about 2 minutes before I wrap up. Any last thoughts for each other or for the group?
I guess one thing that I want to say really quickly, and I agree with what Eric just said, but I also want to push back just a teensy bit, because I do think that like resources and is like really helpful in many ways, but like I don't want to learn how to make money like a millionaire, because there's no way that could happen without exploitation happening. And as someone working at the very bottom of the supply chain, you know, someone's paying for that $100,000, or someone, you know, paid for it in a different way. So I think for me, like I think that, and I know Tempestt and I had this conversation with a few others a little while back, but I think if the goal of foundations is not to end the system of having to give money to people who don't have it, I think then you're doing your job wrong. You know, your job is to also see an end for your own institution. There should not be a world where like people have money that just like give it out because they've made it on the backs of people who look like us, and then they want to feel good about themselves by handing us like a trillionth of that number. So I think at the core, like, and this kind of addresses a little bit of a question that somebody else asked, is that I do think that there's a difference between earning income and capitalism, because I think capitalism requires sort of violence, you know, at a very, very core level, especially when it comes to labor. And so if we can actually think about what it means to be able to center that labor, I think that's one of our biggest challenges, is like, how do we center labor in a capitalistic world with a larger supply chain that's so violent? And it's the most challenging part about this work. But I think that's the part that for me is the most important, is that we don't want to learn how to make money on the backs of other people. And I know that's not what you're saying, but I mean, in general, most of these foundations, if we're going to be realistic, the people who have the money came from very, very horrible, exploitative, violent ways. And we'd be lying to ourselves if we think that any money that is in any of these foundations is like clean and healthy. So I think like that in and of itself is like, I don't want money to be created through violence. And so we have to figure out how we can structurally get rid of just the institution of foundations and philanthropy through this work as well.
I think that's a great note to end on, unless anyone else wants to jump in.
I mean, the only thing that I would add is anyone out there, you should be supporting the work of these three and others that are doing work like theirs and with the organizations that they're
we will take your blood money, though. We will take it.
Well, thank you all so much. I love to end with a laugh. Tempestt, thank you so much for being such a great collaborator on this. Angie, Eric, and Hoda, what an absolute pleasure to have you join the forum and become part of our family. Thank you so much. I want to give a shout out to the team at M+D, especially my partner in crime, Sean McManus, and Samantha Keel, who is running the ship today, as well as Brett Dobbs, Kinga Christian, and Larissa Schulman of M+D. A special thanks to Jennifer Joy and her team at Sutton for being such great partners with us and amplifying the work of the Arts Funders Forum and building our community. I want to thank the whole audience for joining us today and your ongoing engagement with the series. Stay tuned for an announcement on the next talk in the series, and please connect with us on Instagram, LinkedIn, or via email at info@artsfundersforum.com. We'd love your feedback and your ideas for our program going forward. This is a community and that requires engagement, so please engage with us. Thank you all again. To be continued.